My father closed the boardroom doors behind me. That was the first sign something was wrong. The second was my brother Brent sitting in my chair, not literally my chair at the head of the table. My father, Charles Mercer, had claimed that position years ago when he became chairman, but Brent was sitting directly beside him in the seat reserved for me during every major board meeting. A thick folder rested in front of Brent. Post-close leadership. My place at the table was empty. No briefing packet, no acquisition documents, nothing. I looked around at the representatives from the company buying Mercer Grid, our outside counsel, several independent directors, my mother Diane, and half a dozen people who had spent the past 3 months negotiating a $1.2 billion acquisition of the company I had founded. Did the meeting start early? Nobody answered. Dad walked toward his seat. The board has approved the transaction. I stared at him. Without me, the required votes were obtained. I set my notebook down. We were supposed to review the final terms this morning. We did. Something tightened in my stomach. Then Dad glanced at Brent. There's also been a decision regarding leadership after the transaction. For one stupid second, I thought he was about to tell me what my role would be after the acquisition. Instead, he said, "We're giving the equity to Brent." I actually waited for him to explain. What equity? The portion associated with your executive position. I turned toward my mother. Diane folded her hands calmly. Your father and I believe Brent is better positioned for the next phase. I looked back at Dad. You can give Brent your shares if you want. His expression hardened. I'm not discussing this with you. The shares you're talking about are registered to me. Dad pushed a document across the table. You've also been removed as CEO, effective immediately. The room went completely still. Then he pointed toward the door. Now get out. You're fired. I didn't move. 9 years. 9 years of Mercer Grid consuming almost every part of my life, and my father had just reduced all of it to a sentence. I looked at Brent. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Then I asked the only question that mattered. So you sold it? My mother laughed softly. We sold our company. Ah, that word hurt more than being fired, because Mercer Grid had never started as theirs. It started with me in a rented office above a printing shop, writing routing software for small freight operators that were losing money because their trucks spent too many hours empty. Dad had called it a hobby. Mom had asked when I was going to find something stable. They became interested only after regional carriers started calling me instead of the other way around. By the time Dad invested through the Mercer Family Trust, Mercer Grid already had customers, employees, and revenue. I welcomed him anyway, partly because we needed the capital, mostly because I thought his investment meant he finally believed in me. Standing in that boardroom, I realized what he had eventually decided instead. If he invested in what I built, then eventually he could call it his. Dad leaned back. Security can escort you if this becomes difficult. I looked toward the acquisition binders. Give me the executed documents. No, I'm still a shareholder. You no longer have authorization to access transaction materials. And there it was, confirmation. For weeks, something had felt wrong. Board files disappeared from my portal. Meetings were moved without explanation. Brent started taking calls with senior executives who normally reported to me. When I asked Dad about it, he blamed the acquisition process. I had suspected they were negotiating around me. I had never imagined they planned to remove me before the transaction was even finished. I picked up my notebook. Then I left my company laptop on the table. Dad watched me do it and seemed almost satisfied. Brent finally spoke. Judith, don't make this uglier than it has to be. I looked at him. Do you even understand what they promised you? His jaw tightened. The lawyers handled everything. I turned toward the buyer's legal team. One attorney wasn't looking at me. He was staring at his tablet, reading. Then the boardroom door opened. An assistant walked in carrying a dark blue folder and handed it to Martin Shaw, senior counsel for the acquiring company. I recognized the cover immediately. My attorney used those folders. Martin opened it, his eyes moved down the first page, then the second. Dad pointed toward the door again. Judith, leave. I reached for the handle. Behind me, a chair scraped across the floor. Martin stood. Actually, Martin said, I think everyone should remain in the room. My hand stayed on the door handle. Dad frowned. For what? Martin closed the folder. The buyer needs to verify an ownership issue before we proceed. Dad gave a short, impatient laugh. If this is administrative, handle it with counsel. Judith has already been removed. Martin looked at me. Miss Mercer can stay. That was the word he used, but temporarily was more than my father had intended to give me 5 seconds earlier. I walked back toward the table. Brent shifted in my chair. Dad looked irritated enough to say something, but one of the buyer's executives had already leaned toward Martin. What issue? Martin didn't answer yet, and while everyone waited, I found myself thinking about how my parents had gotten enough power inside Mercer Grid to put me in this position at all. 9 years earlier, they hadn't wanted anything to do with it. When I started Mercer Grid, I used almost all my savings and a small angel investment from two people who believed freight logistics was about to become far more software-driven. Dad thought I was being reckless. You have a computer science degree and management experience, he told me one Sunday. You could walk into a six-figure job tomorrow. I don't want somebody else's job. You want to gamble your savings instead? Mom was gentler. That somehow made it worse. You're 34 now, Judith. At some point, stability matters. I wasn't 34 then, I was 25. But even in my 20s, my mother spoke as though I was already running out of time. For the first 2 years, they rarely asked about Mercer Grid, unless they were checking whether I had failed yet. Then we landed a national freight client, then another. Revenue tripled. We hired 30 people in 11 months. Suddenly, Dad wanted to see the office. He walked through the engineering floor, shook hands with my employees, and asked questions like he had always believed the company would work. 6 months later, Mercer Grid needed capital for expansion. That was when he made the offer. The family trust can invest. I stared at him across his study. You want to invest. You need money. I have capital. That's business. But it didn't feel like business to me. It felt like something I had wanted for years. Approval. So I said yes. The trust bought a meaningful stake during the expansion round. Later, financing diluted everyone, including me, and Dad's relationships helped us recruit investors and directors. Eventually, the board made him chairman. I convinced myself it was good governance. He had experience. I had product vision and operational control. For a while, it worked. Then Brent joined. My younger brother had never built software or managed engineers, but he could walk into a room full of clients and have everyone laughing within 10 minutes. Dad loved that. Mom loved introducing him as our strategy guy. I hired Brent into corporate development because he genuinely was good with people. What I didn't expect was how quickly my parents started treating him like my eventual replacement. Give him more visibility, Dad told me repeatedly. He has visibility. You keep him on the edges. He's been here 18 months. He's family. So am I. Dad's expression changed. That isn't the point. 2 months before the acquisition meeting, I learned just how far things had gone. I walked into Dad's office one evening and found Brent leaving. He froze when he saw me. What were you discussing? Nothing. Dad remained behind his desk. Sit down, Judith. I didn't. Was that an acquisition meeting? I stepped inside and closed the door. Why is Brent in buyer discussions that I'm not in? The buyer wants to understand future leadership. I am future leadership. I'm the founder and CEO. Dad leaned back. They're looking beyond closing. So you're discussing Mercer Grid after the sale without Mercer Grid's CEO. You're taking this personally. I'm taking it literally. His mouth tightened. Then he said something I never forgot. Founding something doesn't mean you own it forever. I stared at him. Are you replacing me? No. Then say exactly what Brent was doing here. I don't owe you an explanation for every conversation I have as chairman. That was the first time I walked out of his office, knowing I could no longer trust him professionally. Mom came to my house 3 nights later. She arrived with wine. She always brought wine when she wanted a difficult conversation to look casual. Your father is worried, she said. About what? That you're becoming defensive. I discovered secret meetings involving the sale of my company. Our company. I looked at her. Even then, she was already using that word. She reached for my hand. Charles just wants to protect the family once the deal closes. From me. Don't do that. Then what are you asking? She hesitated. Don't bring outside lawyers into this. I pulled my hand back. What? Family shouldn't prepare for war against family. That sentence bothered me more than anything Dad had said. People rarely tell you not to hire a lawyer when they are certain your rights are safe. The next morning, I called Elena Park. Elena had handled Mercer Grid's earliest restructuring before our later firms took over most corporate work. I sent her every board notice, financing record, and acquisition document I could legally access. She spent 2 days reviewing them. Then she called me. Judith, I need you not to confront anyone yet. I sat up. Why? There are references here to your equity that don't match the capitalization structure I drafted. My stomach dropped. What does that mean? I don't know yet. Elena, I'm serious. Don't accuse anyone. Don't sign anything new. Do you think they can take my shares? She went quiet for a moment. Then she said, I need to know whether they're confused about what they control or pretending they control something they don't. Martin remained standing at the far end of the boardroom. The celebration atmosphere was gone. 10 minutes earlier, my father had announced a $1.2 billion sale, handed my future to Brent, and fired me in front of everyone. Now nobody was reaching for champagne. Martin looked toward Mercer Grid's transaction attorney. I need you to identify the legal owner of Miss Mercer's founder shares. Dad answered before our attorney could. The Mercer family controls them. Martin turned toward him. Through which entity? Dad paused. The family trust. Martin looked down at the folder Elena had sent him. That wasn't my question. The room became very quiet. Which entity legally owns Judith Mercer's founder shares? Our transaction attorney opened one of the capitalization binders. Pages started turning. Brent leaned forward. Why does this matter? Martin looked at him. Because we're acquiring a company for $1.2 billion. The board already approved the sale. That's a separate issue. Brent glanced at Dad. Martin continued. Board authority, executive employment, and ownership of individual shares are not the same thing. My father's face tightened. Nobody said they were. You just announced that Miss Mercer's equity was being transferred to your son. Dad folded his arms. The Mercer Family Trust financed this company's expansion. We hold substantial voting rights. I understand. Then what exactly is the problem? Martin tapped the folder. I'm asking for the document giving the family trust authority to transfer Judith Mercer's founder holdings. Nobody answered. I watched our transaction attorney continue searching. He pulled one document out, then another. Each time he put it back. That was when I knew Elena hadn't been overreacting. Dad noticed the directors watching him. You're turning a routine restructuring question into something it isn't. Martin remained calm. Then it should be easy to resolve. Across the table, one of the buyer's executives closed the menu for the celebration dinner that had been sitting beside his binder. Another started writing notes. The independent directors, who had avoided looking at me after I was fired, were no longer avoiding anyone. They were staring at my father. Mom turned toward me. You did this. I almost laughed. Did what? You knew there would be questions. I didn't draft the documents Dad signed. You contacted someone. I contacted my attorney after you specifically told me not to. Mom's face hardened. I was trying to stop exactly this kind of spectacle. No, you were trying to stop me from finding out why I needed an attorney. Judith, Brent interrupted. Can somebody just answer the question? Everyone looked at him. He pointed toward the folder in front of him. Am I getting the equity or not? That was the first time Brent seemed to understand that the promise might disappear. Not when I was fired. Not when Dad ordered me out. When his shares became uncertain, Dad turned toward him. Brent, don't worry about it. How am I supposed to not worry about it? It's being handled. Martin opened Elena's folder again. I'm not sure it has been. Dad looked at him sharply. Martin removed several pages. According to these records, a portion of Miss Mercer's founder holdings appears to sit inside an entity called Mercer Founding Holdings LLC. Martin continued. The entity predates the Mercer Family Trust investment. Dad shook his head immediately. That structure was absorbed during later financing. Martin looked toward Mercer Grid's attorney. Was it? Our attorney hesitated. I would need the current operating agreement. Dad's voice rose. This company has been through multiple financing rounds. Of course, early structures changed. Martin turned toward me. Miss Mercer? I said nothing. Elena had told me not to speculate, so I didn't. Dad pointed at me. You see, she doesn't even know. I know enough not to answer a legal ownership question without the documents in front of me. Brent pushed his chair back slightly. This is ridiculous. Then the boardroom door opened. Everyone turned. Elena Park walked in carrying a thick binder. My father went completely still. Elena? She looked at him. Charles, you don't represent Mercer Grid. No. Elena walked around the table. I represent Judith. She sat beside me and placed the binder down. Dad stared at it. You haven't been involved with this company in years. I was involved when the founder structure was created. Martin leaned forward. Do you have the current records? I have certified copies of the relevant records. Elena opened the binder. Dad spoke immediately. If you're here to claim some obsolete entity survived multiple financing rounds, it did. Dad stopped. Elena looked around the table. Mercer Founding Holdings LLC still exists. Mom leaned forward. Then who controls it? Elena pulled out the operating agreement. She could have answered. Instead, she slid the document toward Mercer Grid's transaction attorney. Then she looked directly at him. Before we get to that, I need you to answer something. The attorney slowly raised his eyes. Elena rested one finger on the agreement. Did your client represent to the buyer that he had authority to transfer these shares? Our transaction attorney did not answer Elena immediately. Instead, he turned to my father. Charles, I think we should take a recess. Dad looked almost relieved. Fine, he started to stand. Martin raised a hand. No, everyone stopped. Martin gathered the documents Elena had provided and placed them directly in front of him. The buyer is not comfortable allowing transaction records to leave this room until we understand exactly what has been represented and what can legally be delivered. Dad stared at him. Are you accusing me of something? I'm asking questions. You're holding up $1 billion transaction over paperwork. $1.2 billion, Martin corrected. Which is precisely why we're holding it up. The buyer's CEO leaned toward his legal team. They spoke quietly for several seconds. Then Martin looked around the table. The scheduled closing is suspended pending verification of ownership and transfer authority. My mother's face changed. Suspended? Correct. I looked at the closing binders. That was when something clicked. Dad kept saying they had sold Mercer Grid. Mom had said they sold our company. But the money had not moved. The transaction had been approved. It had not closed. Final signatures were still required. Final delivery conditions were still outstanding. And my parents had fired me minutes before those signatures were supposed to happen. I looked at Elena. She saw that I understood. They wanted me out before closing. She kept her voice low. It appears that way. Suddenly, the past few weeks arranged themselves into a pattern. The missing documents, meetings quietly disappearing from my calendar, Brent being invited into acquisition discussions, Mom asking me not to hire an outside attorney, references to my equity that didn't make sense, and finally firing me in front of everyone before I could see the final closing package. They hadn't just wanted me gone. They had wanted me off balance. Elena opened the operating agreement. Look here. She pointed to a section identifying management authority for Mercer Founding Holdings. My name was there. Sole manager. I read it twice. So they can't give Brent these shares. No. For the first time that morning, something inside me loosened. Then Elena added quietly, don't assume that stops the acquisition. I looked at her. Your parents control significant voting power through the trust, and other shareholders supported the transaction. The board approval may still stand. Dad must have heard enough. He leaned back in his chair. Exactly. Everyone looked toward him. His confidence was returning. We used the wrong terminology regarding Judith's equity. Fine, correct the paperwork. Brent frowned. What does that mean for me? Dad ignored him. He looked directly at Martin. The board approved the acquisition. The shareholders required under the transaction documents approved it. Judith's employment is a separate matter. Martin nodded slowly. That may be true. Dad gestured toward the closing binder. Then adjust Brent's compensation package and proceed. For a moment, I thought he had recovered completely. Maybe my shares were safe, but Mercer Grid would still be sold. Maybe I had stopped Brent from receiving what belonged to me, and nothing more. Brent seemed to reach the same conclusion. He leaned back. A faint smile returned to his face. Martin flipped through the acquisition checklist. Before we discuss proceeding, I need confirmation on another closing condition. Our transaction attorney looked up. What condition? Intellectual property. The smile disappeared from Brent's face. Martin continued. Has the seller satisfied all required intellectual property assignments and transfer consents? Nobody answered. Our attorney looked down at his binder, then at another attorney beside him. That attorney whispered something. Dad noticed. What? The lawyers kept reading. What is it? Dad repeated. And suddenly I remembered something. Not from the acquisition, from years earlier. When Mercer Grid was still small, I had developed much of our original routing architecture before the institutional investors arrived. During our first major financing, Elena had insisted we protect certain founder-developed assets. I remembered sitting in her office signing documents until almost midnight. Patents, source code rights, licensing agreements, founder holdings. Later financing rounds changed so much that I had assumed those early structures had been replaced. But I could no longer remember ever signing a complete transfer of those rights out of the founder entity. I turned toward Elena. She was already pulling another agreement from her binder. She slid it toward Martin. Dad saw it. What is that? Martin began reading. Nobody spoke for nearly a minute. Then he looked toward the buyer's CEO. The CEO held out his hand. Martin passed him the agreement. He read the relevant section. Then he looked at Dad. Our valuation assumes we acquire unrestricted control of the core technology supporting Mercer Grid's primary platform. Of course you do, Dad said. The CEO tapped the agreement. This suggests Mercer Grid may have extensive operating rights without possessing every underlying right required for us to take clean ownership after closing. Dad turned toward our attorney. Is that true? The attorney didn't answer quickly enough. The buyer's CEO did. We will not close a $1.2 billion acquisition without certainty that we control the technology we're paying for. Dad slowly turned toward me. The confidence was gone. What did you do? I stared at him. Nothing. He shook his head. You brought Elena here. You fired me 10 minutes ago. I'm trying to find out what you did. Martin turned toward Elena. One question. Elena nodded. Who has authority to approve this transfer? Her eyes moved toward me. Before she could answer, the buyer's CEO closed the unsigned closing binder. Then he pushed it into the center of the table. The sound of the closing binder hitting the center of the table was surprisingly soft, but nobody missed what it meant. The buyer's CEO folded his hands. We're not signing anything until this is resolved. Dad looked at Elena, then resolve it. Elena didn't react to his tone. She opened the operating agreement and turned it toward the middle of the table. When Mercer Grid was founded, Judith developed the original routing architecture before the company took institutional investment. I know the history, Dad said. Then you should remember the structure. His expression tightened. Elena continued. During the first institutional financing, Mercer Founding Holdings LLC was used to hold Judith's founder shares and specific intellectual property rights. Mercer Grid received exclusive licensing rights to use those assets. Martin nodded. And later financing expanded the company's operational rights. It did not dissolve Mercer Founding Holdings. Dad shook his head. The family trust invested millions into Mercer Grid. Yes, Elena said. Into Mercer Grid. She tapped the agreement. Not into this entity. That distinction changed the room. The Mercer Family Trust owned a substantial stake in the company. It had voting rights. Dad's position as chairman gave him influence over the board, but none of that made Mercer Founding Holdings his. Elena looked directly at him. You had authority to vote shares the family trust legitimately owns. You could participate in a properly constituted board vote concerning Judith's employment, and subject to the governing agreement, you could support the acquisition. She paused. But you could not transfer Judith's founder holdings to Brent. Brent looked at Dad. You said the equity was being restructured. Dad didn't answer. Elena continued. And there is a second problem. She placed the intellectual property agreement beside the operating agreement. The acquisition agreement requires clean delivery of the core intellectual property rights identified in the closing schedule. Those rights cannot be transferred without consent from the entity that controls them. Martin asked. Mercer Founding Holdings? Yes. And who has signing authority? Elena turned the operating agreement toward him. Judith Mercer. Silence. Martin read the provision himself. Sole manager, sole manager. I stared at my own name. The meaning was suddenly very simple. Dad could fire me as CEO. He could vote his legitimate shares. He could support selling Mercer Grid, but he could not sign for me. Martin looked toward the buyer's CEO. Without Mercer Founding Holdings' consent, the required IP transfer cannot be completed under the current closing package. The CEO nodded once. No transfer, no closing. Mom leaned forward. You're saying this entire sale depends on Judith? Part of the closing does, Martin said, and that part is essential. 10 minutes earlier, my father had pointed at the door and told me I no longer belonged in the room. Now nobody was looking at the door. They were looking at me. Brent broke the silence. Dad, did you know she had to sign? Dad picked up a pen, then put it back down. Not in those terms. Our transaction attorney shifted in his chair. Mom turned on him. Why weren't we told? He looked at her evenly. We requested confirmation regarding founder-controlled assets more than once. Dad's eyes narrowed. What are you implying? I'm not implying anything. Our team was told the outstanding founder issues would be resolved before closing. My stomach tightened. Resolved. I looked at Mom, then Dad. They had known there was a problem. Maybe they hadn't understood every legal detail, but they knew something involving my founder rights still needed to be dealt with. That explained the timing. Fire me, humiliate me, convince me the sale was already done, then put whatever documents remained in front of me when I believed I had no leverage left. Martin looked at Elena. How did this discrepancy come to the buyer's attention? I contacted your legal team after reviewing language suggesting Charles intended to transfer assets controlled by my client. Dad stared at me. So you went behind our backs? Elena answered before I could. She verified her ownership rights. You jeopardized a $1.2 billion deal. No, Elena said. Inaccurate ownership representations jeopardized the deal. I made sure the buyer received the correct records before closing. Dad pushed his chair back. This is absurd. I finally spoke. Is it? He looked at me. You know this sale is good for the company. I never said it wasn't. It's $1.2 billion, Judith. Employees get liquidity. Investors get returns. Everyone benefits. Then why did you need to take my shares? That's not what happened. You announced them to Brent in front of me. It was part of a broader restructuring. You fired me immediately afterward. His voice hardened. Because Mercer Grid has become bigger than you. I nodded. I know. That seemed to surprise him. I've known that for years. It became bigger than me when hundreds of employees started depending on it. I leaned forward. But becoming bigger than its founder didn't make it yours. Mom stepped in. Judith, your brother deserves an opportunity too. I turned toward her. He has one. You know what I mean? No, say it. She hesitated. Brent needs something substantial after this transaction. You already have more than enough. There it was. Not ownership, not contracts, need. Apparently Brent needing something made my property available. I looked at him. Did you know those were my shares? He rubbed his jaw. Dad said the holdings were being reorganized. Did he tell you I would be compensated? He said there would be cash elsewhere in the deal. Did you ever ask why I wasn't in the meetings where you discussed giving away my equity? Brent looked down. That was his answer. I could have ended the conversation there. I could have refused to sign anything. Part of me wanted to, but Mercer Grid employed hundreds of people who had nothing to do with what my family had done. So I asked for 20 minutes alone with Elena and the buyer's legal team. We reviewed the economics. The acquisition itself was strong. Employee retention packages were funded. Investors received a fair return. The buyer had a credible plan for Mercer Grid. My parents had poisoned the process. That didn't mean I needed to destroy the transaction. When I returned to the boardroom, Dad looked at me immediately. Well, I'm willing to approve the IP transfer. Mom exhaled. Dad reached for the binder. Under revised terms. His hand stopped. What terms? My founder equity remains mine and receives its proper acquisition value. Nothing belonging to me goes to Brent. Brent said nothing. The employee retention packages remain funded exactly as promised. Neither Mom nor Dad can make representations for me or Mercer Founding Holdings. And if the buyer wants me involved during transition, that agreement is negotiated directly with me. Dad stared at me. You're using this to strip us of control. No, I'm stopping you from exercising control you never had. The buyer's CEO looked toward Martin. After a short conversation, Martin nodded. We're prepared to reopen the closing documents on that basis. Dad's face reddened. You're letting one person rewrite this transaction. The CEO looked at him. We're purchasing Mercer Grid's business and technology, Mr. Mercer. He glanced toward Brent's post-close leadership folder. We're not purchasing the Mercer family hierarchy. Brent slowly closed the folder. The buyer withdrew his proposed leadership appointment pending an independent evaluation. The equity Dad promised him never moved because it had never been Dad's to give. The consequences for my father went further. Within days, independent directors demanded a governance review into how founder-controlled assets had been represented during the transaction. Dad could see where that was heading. Rather than face a removal vote, he resigned as chairman. Mom's influence disappeared with his position. The family trust remained a legitimate shareholder, but it was treated as exactly that, a shareholder, not the owner of everyone else. Several weeks later, the revised acquisition closed at the negotiated $1.2 billion enterprise valuation. My founder stake was paid according to what I actually owned. Employee retention packages remained intact. And when the buyer asked me to stay through transition, they asked me, not my father. I agreed to a limited term with separate compensation and a defined departure date. The family consequences lasted longer. Dad called me after the closing. You embarrassed me in front of people I've known for decades. I almost couldn't believe that was what bothered him. I didn't schedule my firing in front of them. You could have handled it privately. So could you. He had nothing to say to that. Mom tried a different argument. Is one business disagreement really worth destroying a family? It wasn't a business disagreement. What else would you call it? The sale was business. Trying to take my property and hand it to Brent was personal. We spoke less after that, much less. Brent eventually apologized. His message was long. My response wasn't. I told him I accepted the apology, but acceptance didn't mean pretending nothing had happened. Then I added one thing. When someone offers you something valuable, you still have a responsibility to ask whether it belongs to them. Months later, my transition ended. For the first time since my 20s, I didn't immediately build something else. I took several months away from investor calls, board meetings, and quarterly targets. Eventually, I started advising younger founders, and there was one lesson I repeated more than any other. Understand what you own before accepting money from people you love. My parents' investment had helped Mercer Grid grow. That was true. My mistake was believing financial involvement automatically came with loyalty. Their investment gave them rights. It never gave them the right to rewrite who built the company. On my final day at Mercer Grid, I walked past the same boardroom where Dad had fired me. There were new executives inside. Someone else sat in the chair I had once considered mine. I stopped for a second, then I kept walking. The acquisition documents carried my signature. My founder stake had been paid to me. My employees had been protected, and my parents would never control my career again. I didn't need that chair to prove what I had built. My father fired me from the company I built, but when the signatures were finally counted, he learned the one thing he should have checked before telling me to leave, whether the deal could leave without me.